And we are in this for the long haul. It requires hope about the future, no matter how confused we might be about the present. And there's plenty of confusion about the present. But God, thankfully, has a message to a bruised, confused, disillusioned gathering of people. And it comes from that well-known verse in Jeremiah. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. And the epistle reading that Chris read out to us contains Paul's famously debated comments about God's election. For the technical-minded of the congregation, God's foreknowledge, God's calling, predestination. There's a whole series of sermons in each of those words. Simply put, it's basically, in other words, who's in or out of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. But instead of theological speculation about who is excluded by these mysteries, his focus towards the end of that passage is a pastoral concern about who is included in God's love. And so we get, in Romans 8, verse 39, nothing in all of creation can separate us from the love of God. And we need to hear that word now. Not only in Rotherham, that's on the brink of, shall we say, rising number of cases with respect to COVID. Sheffield, that's again on the borderline. Oldham, my hometown, again on the borderline. Rochdale. We need to hear that in these difficult times, and even though there is a sense of normality around, that nothing in all of creation can separate us from the love of God. And Paul goes on to cover 20 threats to our well-being in the kingdom of this world. Suffering, weakness, frustration, bondage to decay. Goodness me, isn't it true when you get older, the aches and pains? My left knee is a right bugger at this moment in time. One day it's fine and the next day I can hardly move it. It's just old age, isn't it? Old age. Ignorance. And there's a lot of ignorance around. People say, yeah, but sucks to social distancing, getting absolutely ratty, even now. Trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword, death, life, angels, demons, powers. I don't know whether people here actually believe in angels, demons and powers, but I do. And they're at work, the present, the future height, depth, and as if he'd overlooked something, he includes anything else in all of creation. But perhaps we can personalise our own lists. COVID, parents, children, the boss, employees, colleagues, bad choices, bedeviling sins, public failure, private disappointments, dark dreams, abuse, anxieties, school, and the list goes on and on and on. But Paul is adamant. Nothing at all can separate us from God's love. And in the Gospel this week, Jesus describes the subtleties of God's kingdom that require a discerning heart. He says that the presence of God's kingdom is like a tiny mustard seed, something insignificant rather than extravagant, fragile, not mighty, unlikely rather than obvious. His kingdom can also be imperceptible, like yeast leavening a batch of dough. It's difficult to detect unless you look carefully. It's not apparent, even though you know it's there somewhere. God's reign is also like a fishing net, containing the good and the bad together, or a field of wheat infested with weeds. And so what do I want? Well, I pray for a discerning heart in order to experience the ultimate reality of God's kingdom. To know that his perfect love is unconditional. And that nothing can separate me from his love. Everything else is secondary. And even though we can't ever get our lives fully right, it doesn't matter, because in the end, nothing, absolutely nothing, can separate us, I believe, from God's love and forgiveness. And it bears repeating and repeating and repeating. Nothing can separate us from God's love. And that's what we need to hear as a community, as a metropolitan borough, as a country, that nothing can separate us from God's love. This is what the archdeacons should be preaching, the bishops should be preaching, the archbishops should be preaching. Nothing can separate us from God's love and forgiveness. And we are in this life and the next in hands far safer and gentler than our own. Because we have a God who is and has triumphed before evil and death. We have a God who can raise dead bodies, bring them to life, redeem what is evil and hopeless. Death itself goes backwards. We have a God who isn't arbitrary or fickle, but a God who is utterly reliable in his promise and goodness, even though we might not be able to see it at the time. And my goodness, I have struggled to see it from time to time, but it's there. He is faithful. And God is not a God who is stupid and unable to deal with our complexity, but a God who fashioned the depth of the universe and the deepest recesses of the human psyche. I am constantly amazed, even just in the drive from Maltby up here to Toulon, the majesty of nature. The fields, the trees, the birds, even my dog Casper. This is a God who demands our love. God is the God of the second chance, and the third, and many, 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 many more. He gives us countless chances to turn back to him and to enjoy his love again. God doesn't just give us a second life. He comes to us in Jesus, on the cross, in the resurrection, and transforms our real life. Ultimately, he is a God in whose hands and in whose promise we are far safer than when we ever rely upon ourselves. In summary, the biggest temptation of our lives is to let go of our identity as being in God's family, and to let go of a trust in God's power, God's knowledge, and God's love, so that we give up doing things his way and we take charge ourselves instead. And we know that that is the road to ruin. It's then we need to remember and to pray that we will become even more embedded in our hearts, that we too have God's voice saying, now and even at the end of time, when we no longer see in a mirror dimly, God's voice saying, you are my child, whom I love, and with you I am well pleased.